Okay, so in this video we're going to go over the domain of a composition. Now these definitions here the definition and the how-to comes from our textbook. All right, so I'll just kind of read them and then we'll kind of discuss a while, talk about them, and then use an example to kind of show how what this definition is trying to tell us and the how-to. Now, for the domain of a composite function, f of g of x is the set of those inputs x in the domain of g, for which g of x is in the domain of f. All right, now so keep in mind that the input for f is now the output, or in other words, the range of g. Okay, so it's important, it's going to be important to, when we're looking for the domain, when we know that a function isn't, that f of x is undefined, that we're not looking for necessarily, what we're looking for is the output of x, the output of g of x, right, that is not going to be part of the domain of f. Okay, so here's what the how-to here. So here's how we're going to do this. So first we're going to find the domain of g, find the domain of f. That'll be step 2. So now the third one says find those inputs x in the domain of g for which g of x is in the domain of f. That is, exclude those inputs x from the domain of g for which g of x is not in the domain of f. Right? So here's the important part, right? G of x is not in the domain of f, right? The output. Okay, so let's actually work through an example here. All right, so for this example, let's say find the domain of f composed with g of x for f of x equals to 1 over x minus 2 and g of x is equal to the square root of x plus 4. Okay, so again, the first step is let's find the domain of g. All right. Okay, so domain, so for g of x, the domain, so looking at g of x, so we have a root, square root, so we need this to be greater than or equal to 0. So we need x plus 4 to be greater than or equal to 0, or subtracting 4 from both sides, x greater than or equal to negative 4. Okay. Okay. All right, and then from here, let's find the domain of, let's see, what is this? Domain of f. So for f of x, all right, so here the domain, here we have the restriction that x cannot be 2, right? That's our only restriction here, right? So the domain, right, that would be division by 0, which is undefined. So it looks something like this. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at the second part here, what to do next. All right. That is, exclude those inputs x from the domain of g for which g of x is not in the domain of f. All right. So in other words, here what we want to do is, so here we have the domain, so the inputs of the inner function. Again, without knowing anything, we would say x is greater than or equal to negative 4. But we want to exclude 2, right, from our composition, right? Now remember, right, the composition here is f of g of x. So we don't want the output to be 2, right? Because remember, the output is now going to be the input of f. Right, so what we do next here is we say, all right, I know that f cannot take in an input of 2. Well, if the input is the output of g of x, what I need to find now is, when is this true? When does 2 equal to g of x? All right. Okay, so here, we'll have, all right, so let me 2 square root of x plus 4, square both sides, subtract 4 from both sides, and we get x is equal to 0. All right, so here we're gonna exclude this value, right? X cannot equal to 0, because when x is 0, we get 2, and I cannot put that in my composition into the function f. All right, so now let's put all this together here. So here being f of g of x, right? So the domain, right? Here we're gonna lower bound of -4, right? Because it's still the inner function is still my g of x, up to and excluding 0. Okay, union with 0 to infinity. Right, so we start with our domain of g, and then we exclude any values that are going to make this f of x undefined, and that value being at 0. Notice here, x can still be 2 in my composition, right? So when I do 2, I start with the inner function, and I have root 6, and that is perfectly okay. The only problem is at 0, right? 0, root of 4, which is 2, and that gives me undefined. Okay, so just keep that in mind, right? This is there's a lot of detail in finding the domain of these compositions.